Good evening. Salam. Thank you all for joining us. Is this on? Yeah? Good. My name is Huda Fakhreddin. I teach Arabic literature here at Penn, and it is my pleasure to welcome Moriel Rothman-Zecher to the Kelly Writers House and to Penn. We go far back, and we'll get to that. But let me introduce him. He is much more than these words on the page. He is a Jerusalem-born novelist and poet. His first novel, Sadness is a White Bird, was a finalist for the Dayton Literary Peace Prize and the National Jewish Book Award, the winner of the Ohioana Book Award, and longlisted for the Center for Fiction's first novel prize. His poetry and essays have been published in many places, including Barrelhouse, Colorado Review, the Paris Review's Daily, the New York Times, The Common. He is the recipient of the National Book Foundation's 5 Under 35 honor. Are we still under 35? 2 MacDowell Fellowships. His second novel, which we're celebrating today, is Before All the World. It just came out on October 11th. So I'm going to let Moriel read from it, and then I have some questions for him, and I invite you all to ask some questions as well. Tafadhal.
Thank you, Huda. Shukran. Thank you to Jessica and to everyone here at the Kelly Writers House for having me. Thank you to everyone for being here. We thought about potentially putting 4 pumpkins in the front row just to fill up that seat. This is my 5th or 6th event around this book, so I've been bustling around and chatting about it, but this one feels particularly special. It's really such a gift to get to be here in conversation with Huda, who was one of my favorite teachers as a college student, who taught me an immense amount about poetry, about translation, about writing, about being, and things that wended their ways very directly into both of my novels. So thank you once again. And that is, so before I read a section from this novel, that's a useful framing to have. So the novel is framed as a translation. It follows 2 Yiddish-speaking immigrants from a fictional village in northeastern Ukraine who make their way to America in the early 1930s after everyone in their village is killed in a pogrom. And they're here in Philadelphia. They connect with a queer black communist ghostwriter, translator named Charles. And the 3 of them navigate America's often nightmarish racial and sexual politics. And the characters are also the author and the translator, 2 of them. So Gittel, one of the 2 immigrants, is the author of the manuscript. Charles is the translator of the manuscript. And if you pick up the book, you'll see that there's sort of a false title page where it says a maise, or a story, by Gittel Chayeles, translated by Charles Patterson Roses. And a quick anecdote. So before my book came out, a friend, much wiser than me, much more experienced than me in the writing world, reminded me, she said, "Don't check Goodreads." And I said, sure, yeah, great point. I went home that evening and blocked the site on my laptop. But as part of our brains are wont to do, I checked on my cell phone a few days before the book came out, just to see what people were saying, just curious. There are some people who got early copies and left some early reviews. And one of the first ones that I glance at, of course, is a 1-star review. And for folks not familiar with the medium of Goodreads, it's 1 out of 5. That's as low as it can get. And they left a comment. And in the comment, this person wrote, and I'm paraphrasing here, they wrote, "Not an enjoyable reading experience. Couldn't get into this book. Maybe the issue is with the translation." So I like to open with that story, thinking about both, the readerly practice of not reading so closely, but also I think there's actually something kind of moving about that response if I allow myself to zoom out for a moment. That this person picked up the book, read who knows how many pages, couldn't get into it, But still imagine that somewhere out there, there's this beautiful original, right? There is this gorgeous Yiddish manuscript that maybe if they'd been able to read that one they would have loved. So I actually find that comment, if I start with a little bit of snark about the one-star review, actually there's something quite interesting and moving about that theory that this person brought to the book. So the first short section I'm going to read to you is from a little later in the manuscript, in the novel. It's a novel now. It's no longer a manuscript. How fun. And here, Charles and Gittel are sitting at Charles's apartment, corner of 17th and Lombard. And they are smoking cigarettes, drinking coffee, talking about translation. Charles has offered to translate Gittel's manuscript, even though, as he admits, his Yiddish is not perfect. And she says, okay. So they're going and they're discussing his first effort at translation, translating a short story Gittel wrote about her arrival to America. And it goes like this. I'll say one more thing before I go, that there are footnotes in the book, and the footnotes are Charles's notes about the text, the translator's notes about the text. So if I do this at any point, it's indicating a footnote. How about Zatelsk? Zatelsk is the name of the fictional village. How about Zatelsk? What? Should Zatelsk be capitalized in American? Yeah. Why? Gittel shrugged. Maybe a dust village is more like a person than a god. How about Philadelphia then? You decide. Is your Philadelphia more like a person or a god? Well, what's a god, comrades? A false hope? I'll drink to that. And a person? A thing made from maises, story, taive, urge, and the small choices of each moment. Charles nodded. All right. One more question while we're on the subject. A malech? Jo, nu, vos, Charles, is an angel, yes? Gittel shook her head. Angel is a god word. Maybe better sibling, better a sibling, oh wah, a sibling what is a vek, what is gone. And the malech made from only eyes, also a sibling? No, but it can choose at any time its own humanish collaborators, Gittel said. So perhaps it could choose labele, or also I. Also me. Yeah, also you it could choose. No, I meant... Never mind. I tend to wax a bit pedantic, which is what I liked about this Maisa Git. The warts and welts, if I may. It felt corrective to the deadly puritanical neatness of this place, which I've inherited despite our mutual loathing. It's truly hellacious, Gittel, this place. The way it sinks its glistening teeth into my flesh at every opportunity, but also simultaneously wends its way between my own teeth, into my mouth, onto my tongue, my pen. I think that's why I winced like I did at your comment about the semicolons. But maybe it's more than just semicolons versus commas, or tall letters versus short ones. Maybe there's something ultimately freer about the Yiddish, something that can't be oversat into American. No. All tongues are the same upground human fish, I think. There is no such holy mama tongue what helps any person to do anything, or to be anything, or what keeps a person from anything. Also, if we're oversitting here into American all the way, Yiddish just is Jewish. And Jewish with a small letter, yo. But of course, Charles said. What else? So the section that they're talking about, the story that they're talking about, comes earlier in the book, later in the translational process. What's presented here is, for the most part, the second draft or third draft that Charles has translated, and earlier in the sequence of time. So this is a section that takes place right after Gittel has left her village. She and Leib are the only survivors of this massacre. Everyone is killed but the two of them. And Gittel spends the next 21 days in the village burying or trying to bury everyone in her village. Sometimes it winds up just putting a leaf on top of their body, and trying to say at least a one-line story about each one, which ultimately she doesn't even succeed at doing that. But she writes a list. So you should know that she has this list, and she keeps this list with her after she's left Zatelsk. Okay. And so Gittel left Itzel's house. What stood beyond the stand of trees within what Gittel had stood when the clan of death had come to take every Jew from Zitelsk, Jewish for what stands or falls beyond catastrophe, into the forest. And she away went from Zitelsk, never to return, approximately a wandering Aramean, approximately dead, but for the pull forward of her feet and the Malach babble, and the various taives of her body, and she moved then north into the belly of some or other city, Pinsk first and later Minsk, and in each she was scrubbing in silence during the day, and then down laying her head during the night on some or other floor, where in the pre-dawn hours she could tell to her siblings any maise she pleased, and they could tell to her. And this she did more or less for 7 years, and then 7 more. And in this time, Gittel, of course, was having taives and boredom, what were leading her to lay with various men. And one of those men, in the 6th year of the 2nd cycle of 7, was called Meishke. And he was an editor at the Minsker Journal, in what's offices Gittel was then scrubbing days, and what was called literarische Blumen, literary flowers, but what everyone called Marx's beard. And what was known even in America for its relishment of communal welts and warts, or so Meishke claimed, his flowersome chest, all piffled and hairfish blooming, and after they have stipped for the 2nd or 4th puffish time in Gittel's small room, for Meishke was matrimonial unto some shoshke or other, and could not thus bring himself to bring herself to his own larger room, in that once after, Meishke's blinksome eyes fell upon what Gittel had written during another once before, 7 years after the forest, perhaps. It's what? It's only time. There is always before. And what pages she kept under her pillow some nights to read and recite, and what pages she had neglected to remember to away put this night before Meishke came. Her list of Jews what had been alive, and 3 prayer words to the non-existent death judge of truth, what with a before maise for some, and Meishke read the pages while still upon her sleep mat, and then asked if he could place her poem inside the beard, for they were working hard, all the workers were, he said, on an issue commemorating the events what had occurred during the time of the revolution and the afterwar, etc., though he would of course make sure that they did not mention a single hair from Trotsky's mustache, times altar and all, and they'd attribute the hanging of any collaborator of the Malich made from only eyes to Tovarish Stalin himself, and they would certainly not mention any instantiations of red lead Jew slaughter soever, and Gittel wanted to say, it's not a poem, it's a list. But she was tired and wanted for him to leave, and so she said, I should care where you place it, so long as you back bring the pages. And so he took them, and he brought them back, and Gittel and Meishke stipped maybe 2 or 4 more times until Gittel grew bored, and away sent Meishke into the wilderness of Minsk. And Gittel returned to the toilets and the floors of the beard, and she ignored him when he tried to grab her attention there with pists and other pesters, and then one time she turned toward the pist sound, peeking from this pisher's pisk, Slubberdegullian's craw, and said, Yo, Meishkele! A beautiful thanks. I'd love to come to dinner by you and your shoshkele. Monogamy is the bailiwick of the bourgeoisie. What? And the other editors horse laughed with their big teeth, and Meishke red flushed, and then that was that, until maybe 2 or 4 months later, when a letter arrived at the offices of Literarische Blumen, and Meishke himself brought it to Gittel, what was of course not expecting any letter soever, because of how all the people what she knew were away taken to the forest, etc., but was not displeased to see Meishke's face so grum and coyfish when he told her it was addressed to her, and she took it from his hand and saw that her name was indeed scrawled on its outside, but that it had been opened, lilacish seal overbroken, and she spit lightly near Meishke's nice shoes, and then long looked at Meishke, and he away looked for shame, but did not leave, and so she reopened the already opened envelope, and saw that in it was a document declaring that she, Gittel Chayales, had been awarded passage to America. Hurrah. And Meishke, having already read its contents, murmured then that no one got such things these days, and then began to explain about the quota's jaws, but Gittel off-cut him and said, I know, I do read every now and then a famous journal what's called Literary Flowers. And she looked down at the Amerikanisch welcome paper in her hand, and noticed that attached to its back was a notelet, in Jewish, what she overturned and read, Teiere Tochter von Chayele, ich hab lieb gehad dein Liedele, far was kimmst di nit in Amerika, kiem leien vor dein Liedele, far die nebech dicke Jiden do. Dear Chayele's daughter, I liked your little poem. Why don't you come to America? Come, declaim your little poem for the poor neglected Jews here. And it was signed, The Baroness. And Gittel looked at Meishke, what gazed howlishly with a certain sort of taiva at the papers in her hands, and Gittel laughed without smiling, and nodded her head, and bid him farewell with a finger tap on his fleecesome forearm and a hand pat on his smooth-shaven cheekele. And then she, Gittel Chayales, took the money which she had saved, and also a little extra what for a socialistic tip, and she sprinkled it into the Atlantischer's opened jaws, and the water chickled to itself, distracted by its newfound fortune. And so when Gittel was 31 years old, she left her home continent and its ever-humming river of death, and went into the ocean, and there she enjoyed outspitting each of her own mices into the water, and lo, the waters responded by upcasting their salt over her flesh and her eyes, such that her gums became coated with salt, and her eyelashes stuck together, and her memories overcrusted and became grains of salt, and were dispersed throughout the waters, and the there waters of the past and the present. And Gittel grew tired, and thought she might begin her undergoing, and come finally to rest in the waves, but she was just then propped up by porpoises, her bare feet borne west on their slick black fish backs, their sharpish maws opening for to shriek their underwater psalms loudly enough that Gittel could hear them calling in voices waterish, familiar, sweet one, beloved one, tired one, blessed be your tired feet. Over the subdued wind, and under the salt glass slice of the water and the soft dark sluice of the murk, what was overlapping their backs as they flapped forward, or under their bellies as they leaped over the face of the deep and grey. A small flaming blackbird led the way like a needle and thread sewn through the sky, and Gittel down lay to rest her head on the backs of the creatures, their soft smooth skin flickering underneath her cheek and above their muscles, right on the border between the water and the there water, and on the other side of the Atlantischer wetness sat plump and bespectacled America. The blackbirds down flopped dead onto land, smoldering heaps of feather and fine bone. 2 by 2 the porpoises swam away into the grayscape, shrieking as they swam, and Gittel was left to stagger alone like a drunken ham unto the edges of her new stepfather's bepoisoned and snakesome garden, holding in her hands a paper invitation hewn from a tree, wishing she could hold instead the hands of her siblings hewn from the wind. Ja, and of course, Gittel sibling ours, we are all wishing this. Owa. What's your name? Said America. Gittel Chayales, said Gittel. Incomprehensible, said America. Gittel Zhytomyrsky then, said Gittel. Gittel Felштiner, Gittel Berdichevsky, Gittel Skviraski, Gittel Proskurover, Gittel Zatelski, Gittel Rechitaski. Gertie Radish, said America. There we are. Nothing, said Gittel. Oh, Jewess, said America, lose the sourpuss. You made it. Mazel tov cocktails for all. And what's in a name after all? Look at me. Tata Vespucius indeed. No edible complex to be had there at all. Woof. Given that Dad was basically born dead in terms of significance. What? Ha! And still, I did all right for myself, right? Didn't I? You can smell the leather in my eye sockets. Here, smell. Nice, right? Scraped either from a Jersey cow or from some red-finned member of the Garment Workers Union or other. Isn't that right, Gertie? You've got no intentions, I'm sure. Anyway, enough about you. My essence, of course, is dentistry. In the course of no time at all, I sank my thankful milky teeth into the belly of this other fellow, coated my molars with his flesh, daintily tugged his molars from his mouth's flesh, and he barely yelped, Gertie, for they do have a much higher pain tolerance, biologically speaking, and I dribbled his warm mouth blood all over my pretty garden, and now, gosh darn it, Jewess, would you look at all that corn? I warned my daughters of his ways, and then started a school and built a town, and then another, kept his teeth tucked away in my cheek for good luck, called it a day or two, and good grief, what do we got? A room for you, Gertie, a room of your own. A room that I built all by my lonesome, no help at all. Look away from my face. I'd strongly recommend that you, look at all the pictures on the wall, would ya? Gittel vomited. Don't look too long, though. As I was saying, lose the sourpuss. Not a good look in these parts. You've Jewed your way in here, and good on ya, Gertie. Good on ya, Radish. I'm a big fan of initiative. You're here to peruse your happiness or something like that, right? Right, now do a little twirl, would ya? Atta girl. Atta Gertie. You'll like it here. I'm sure of it. Here, have a tooth. Gittel stood still as America off-picked all her lice, muttering to itself under its vinegar and rheum-nut breath, and somewhere was the sound of a bell clanging inside a wintersome nostril. And every now and then America paused to scratch the undersides of its eyelids with one of its 13 tongues. And then it was finished, and so, deloused, Gittel grabbed hold of a collection of dust motes and border moths, what to use as currency, and was then muscled onto a train, and fell therein to sleep, and she slept for longer than she almost ever slept, for hours, or at least for a long hour. Arrived to Philadelphia, Gittel awoke. I'll stop there.
Thank you for that. That's something. We're going to get to that. I have so many questions about this. But let's start before All the World. The last time, I used to call you Maury back then, when you were young. The last time before Philadelphia, the last time you and I had a conversation was in a little building called Barrelhouse on a little hill in Middlebury, Vermont. And this is a room where you and I regularly met, and Mahmoud Darwish and Yehuda Amichai joined us often. Mm-hmm. And this was right before you went out into the world. So my question is, after Middlebury and before All the World, what happened?
So after Middlebury, so in those mornings, I think it was 10 o'clock in the morning or so that we'd meet in this little office, and we spent this time translating poetry in multiple directions, from Hebrew to Arabic, from Arabic to English, from Arabic to Hebrew. And in your class, I encountered poems both in the original and in translation that changed my life. I'll get back to that. But so right after that, I returned to Israel, Palestine, to Jerusalem, where I was born, and was involved in left-wing dissent efforts, mostly around housing evictions and housing demolitions in East Jerusalem and in the West Bank, in the southern West Bank. And I also was writing as I was going. I was sort of keeping a blog. I would tweet. I would occasionally write articles. And it was my way of making sense of the world, my way of making sense of what I saw. And a year later, I got my draft notice to the military. I knew that I would get it at some point. I was an Israeli citizen from birth. And at that point, I decided to refuse military service. I spent a few weeks in military jail, got out, faced the kind of void of what's next that many 23-year-olds face. It was just had a particularly strange valence. And I thought, maybe I should write a book. I should, compile some of these blog posts and tweets and musings and op-eds and put it into book form. And, and who doesn't want to hear about someone refusing to serve in the Israeli military? So I found a book agent who was interested in working with me. And a few weeks before we were going to send off the proposal for this book, I told her, actually, I don't want to write this book. I'm going to write a novel instead. And she says to me, have you ever published any sort of fiction ever? And I said, I have not. She said, great, get back to me when you have a draft. I think assuming she'd never hear from me again. And over the next few months, I wrote in this sort of frantic mode that I never intend to recreate, 100,000 words of the first draft of this book. And it wasn't, and I sent it over to my agent at that point, and she said, I waited a month, 2 months, 3 months. Eventually she got back to me and said, listen, you're a good writer. There are some beautiful parts here. If you can change the whole thing, I'd be happy to work with you. And I did. Over the course of the next year, I changed the whole thing back and forth many times. And the reason I mentioned our poetry class and our translation seminar was because the central poem that it was the starting point for this book is a 1967 poem by Mahmoud Darwish, Jundi Yahlam Bizanabiq al-Bayda, or A Soldier Dreams of White Lilies. And reading this poem in your class, both in translation first and later in the original, was a moment that I don't think happens often, where a poem, at least hasn't happened, where a poem pushes you to think something you don't want to think, to believe something you don't want to believe, right? Because usually we have our beliefs, we set our beliefs when we're 16 or 18 or whatever point, and then we find texts that support that, right? And we find things that bolster our beliefs and uplift what we think about the world. And there were other poems of Darwish's that kind of bounced off of my armor. Identity Card is a famous poem of Darwish's, where there's, in translation, the line is something like, if I get hungry, I will eat my usurper's flesh. And for me, that was like, okay, well, that's too much. You're gonna eat my flesh, and then, so my kind of arguing back and forth against this one, and I said, and that kind of bounced off of my shell of living within an sort of Israeli and Zionist narrative. But A Soldier Dreams of White Lilies couldn't bounce off so easily, because what Darwish does in this poem is writes most of the poem from the perspective of an Israeli soldier. And there's no moment in the poem where it feels false, where it feels like he's writing toward a straw man or a caricature, where it feels like he's making up a sort of a two-dimensional fiction in order to make his point. The poem is pulsing with resonance, with truth. And the line that I ultimately took here is, the soldier says to the speaker of the poem, who's called Mahmoud, "Did you feel sad?" I asked. "Mahmoud, my friend," he said to me, "sadness is a white bird that does not come near a battlefield. Soldiers commit a sin when they feel sad." And I think that poem in some ways was responsible for my refusing to serve in the military, was the poem I wanted to write toward and write around when I wrote this first book.
Yeah, so I think some of the poems bounced off your armor, you said, because you had decided to be his other, Mahmoud Darwish's other. But once I read Sadness is a White Bird, I see you moving somewhere else to a different position. You sit somewhere different now, right? When you went out to the world, you were going to Palestine, in my mind. Right? It was a more complicated journey in yours. So we're not going to spend too much time talking about this first book. We want to get to before all the world, but I'd like you to still spend some time with the first book and tell us what connects them. So it seems to me, having read the first and the second, that you find in contending with or traveling back to or just sitting with grave wrongs. Trauma is a cliche word to use here, but massacres, genocide, ethnic cleansing, you traveled to them physically when you went back to Palestine, you traveled to them in history here. It triggers you to write. This is the writing space, is it fair to say?
Absolutely.
Connect them so that we can get here.
It's the best question I've been asked in this entire series of book events.
You're still in the beginning of the
I'm still
tour.
in the beginning. The ones that can supersede that will come tomorrow. I think what connects them, you're absolutely right. You pointed out a thing that, and that's the gift of getting to do this conversation, is I don't know that I would have been able to say that so succinctly. But that's right. The two motivating impulses for my fiction are mass atrocities and poetry, and how poetry grapples with mass atrocities. And so for the second book, I was at an artist's residency at MacDowell up in New Hampshire, and I just finished edits on my first book. And a friend had given me the advice, probably the same friend who told me not to look on Goodreads, but this time I listened to her, and she said to me, before your first novel comes out into the world, make sure you're working on something else, because otherwise you'll just be refreshing Goodreads despite your best intentions. And I said, okay, well, what am I going to work on? And I finished edits on this first book, and I sort of wandered into the James Baldwin Memorial Library at MacDowell, and this little volume caught my eye, and it was called An Anthology of Modern Yiddish Poetry. And it had been selected and translated by a fellow at the same artist residency in 1966, Ruth Whitman. And I sort of I squirreled this book back to my cabin and in the middle of snowy New Hampshire woods in February, and read the poems out loud in translation. And I felt like I was reading the work of family members who I hadn't known I had. And I don't just mean that in the parochial sense. I don't just mean that in the sort of family members because they were Yiddish poets and because my great-grandparents were Yiddish speakers. I don't just mean because they were sort of writing about themes of the Jewish past, and that was a past that my family went through. I also mean in sort of the deeper sense, which is the sort of the literary and the human sense. And so I found these new family members, Jacob Glotstein, Anna Margolin, Rachel Korn, Itzik Manger, Moshe Leib Halpern, names that aren't really known in the poetry world, even though they are phenomenal poets. And I think if there's one kind of missionary hope an ancillary missionary hope that I have with this book is that some folks who love poetry will say, okay, well, why don't I pick up a translation of Jacob Gladstein? Why don't I pick up a translation of Anna Margolin? So just a note on that for all of you poetry readers out there. But so reading these poems, and then I thought back to our experience in some ways, where I read Darwish in translation, and then I read Darwish in the original, and that dialectic between the two, there wasn't one experience that was superior to the other. There wasn't one experience that, that the original was transcendent and the translation was fine, or the translation spoke to me perfectly because I understood all the English, whereas the original was breaking my teeth. But it's this dialectic for me of being able to read the original and the translation, to bounce back and forth between the texts, to think that the two texts read with one another actually lead to a third place that is different from either of the two when taken alone. And so then there was this moment of heartbreak where I could only read one side of the Yiddish anthology. I didn't know a word of Yiddish. I knew a word. I knew schlepp and schmuck and whatever else trickles down into American vocabulary, but I didn't really know Yiddish. I couldn't read these serious poems. And so I said, okay, I want to write toward this. I want to write toward these sort of catastrophic massacres that these poets are writing around. And I want to be able to be in conversation with them in both languages. So, if I wrote the first draft of this one in 10 weeks, it took me probably 2.5, 3 years to write the first draft of this one because I had to go and learn Yiddish, which is still an ongoing process.
Yeah, so there's a lot of research that went into this. But before we get to that, the frame of translation. So you told us a little bit and you read from places that help us understand that this is framed as a translation. This is not your work. This is Charles's translation of Gittel's book. It's not your book. So what has that distance allowed you to do? The fact that you've distanced yourself from it. And the footnotes and the italics, all the voices that live in this book that are not yours. Does that give you freedom to do more than you would have done had you been writing a novel about two Jewish immigrants surviving a massacre and showing up in Philadelphia?
Well, certainly then if I'd been writing a nonfiction book about that subject. And that to me is the space that I actually feel for me is a very similar space, the space of fiction and the space of poetry, which for me comes first and foremost from an unconscious space. And I recently wrote this little craft essay singing the praises of writing at 5 o'clock in the morning because I'm exhausted. Because I'm exhausted and my daily sort of societally acceptable, polite self isn't quite woken up yet, and my worries haven't quite kicked into gear, and my overthinking hasn't sort of started working at 1,000,000 miles an hour. And so I write in this mostly unconscious space. At least I do the first draft in a mostly unconscious space where I don't really know what it is I'm writing. I knew I wanted this multiplicity of voices. I didn't know whose they were at first. Later, it turns out, so they're in the text, if folks see the text, there are italics that are indented. And certainly, these italics are not around Yiddish words. I made, in both books, there's a sort of a parallel crusade to de-italicize non-English transliteration. I think it's an awful practice in the literary world to italicize non-English words. Because I know as a reader, I see italics around the non-English word and I think unessential, inessential. I don't know, not misessential. I think less important. I think I might as well skip over it. I think I don't know that language, so why should I spend the effort sounding out a sound in my mouth? And I think what I hope to offer readers, and obviously I have no control over how anyone reads either of these books, but what I hope to offer to readers is the opportunity to sit with a word in your mouth, to see how the word maise feels, even if you don't know right away that it means story, to see how the word habibi feels, even if you don't know right away that it means my darling. But the italics here are not for non-English words, not for Yiddish, but rather for the voices of the Malochim, Gittel's siblings, who are commenting, even though they've all been murdered, they're commenting on her life for the subsequent 15 years. And then the footnotes, I knew I wanted some sort of footnotes, but if you read books that have non-English words in them, a lot of times there'll be footnotes that'll sort of translate for you that have no frame to them. that feels like the author's like, and wait a second, let's put the fiction aside and like, don't worry, I'll tell you, Maisa means, and then it sounds like a Wikipedia entry at the bottom of a work of fiction that is supposed to, for me, is supposed to live in this realm of strangeness and swirl and sound as if it were the sort of younger, scrappier, more popular cousin of a poem. That's how I think about novels. less intelligent, more popular, scrappier, you know. But so the frame of having a translator be a character was one that I didn't have originally, but one that was exhilarating to come upon, because now the footnotes aren't there for the reader in 2022, or at least not only. They're also there for Charles to be in conversation with Gittel. Sometimes he pushes back factually. Sometimes he admits to making up a word. Sometimes he sort of goes onto a whole digression about agent nouns. And it was, and that for me also gave me a voice as to what voice the footnotes would be in, rather than the voice of Wikipedia. They would be in the voice of a character who I'd spent 5 years getting to know.
Yeah, and he sometimes comments on like difficult, sensitive issues, racial issues, sexual issues, sexuality. So that's it's an interesting space on the page. I'm looking at the time and I'm running out of it, and I want to turn to audience questions. But one last thing. So we have translation on our minds. We have so many languages that inhabit this book, and it. Not to sympathize with the Goodreads review, not sympathizing, but this is a difficult book to read, because as a reader, you're unlearning so much, and you find yourself sitting at the edge of one language, the cusp of another that you don't know. It's a very interesting space. How did you convince a publisher to publish this? And what did your editor do? Because speaking of italics, as somebody who writes about Arabic and English, I'm always worrying about what people think, what is correct grammar, and what do you do with non-Arab. This must have been a huge effort, and a collaborative effort as well. Tell us just a little bit before we turn to questions.
Yeah, so that question of difficulty for me, and this is where I think that my literary family and the sort of the literary roots of this book are not parochial. They're not just in the Yiddish world, and this book is not. There was no moment in writing this book where I thought this book is primarily for a Yiddish-speaking audience or an audience who's curious about Yiddish. This book is for readers. This book is for people who take the project of reading seriously, and probably people who read poetry are going to find a lot to appreciate in this book. And I think I leaned heavily, actually, on a number of Irish authors who I adore. James Joyce from the last century and Emer McBride from this one. Emer McBride is one of my favorite living authors. And you read her work and the first pages are almost incomprehensible, right? There are no sentences that are correct in standard English grammar. And you think, how do I get through this? And then 30, 40 pages into the book, you've learned the language of how the book speaks. You've learned essentially a new language inside the book. And to me, that is an exhilarating process as a reader. And I think I hoped to do 1/5 of what McBride does in her work in this project. And in terms of editors, I got lucky beyond lucky. There in the literary world, there's sometimes this grumbling of like editors don't edit anymore. Like back in the day, the editors used to edit, and now they just send it off to Goodreads or whatever. No one actually says that. But my experience was the exact opposite. So we sent this book to Jenna Johnson at Farrar, Straus and Giroux, and Jenna read the first few chapters, and she said, "I love this. I don't understand a lot of it. I'd be excited to work with you." She called me and said, "What I envision is 3 or 4 rounds, which could be 2 or 3 years. Are you up for that?" And I kind of like fell out of my chair in delight. I was like, not only am I up for that, I need that. And more so because Jenna's not Jewish. Jenna doesn't know a word of Yiddish. But she told me in our first conversation, she reads Walt Whitman once a year. Right, so she returns to the poetry that she loves again and again. And I said, okay, this is a good person to work with. And what she did over the course of this book was she mostly sort of tapped around. If this book is kind of a strange forest, she would walk around the forest tapping on the various trees and be like, this doesn't feel like a real tree. This feels like it's made out of paper. And then I could respond and say, actually, no, that tree has roots because of this, and this is the logic for why those voices are speaking. And other times she'd push and I'd say, yep, nothing there. That was me just sort of like the unconscious space of 5 a.m. writing just trickling over into a later draft. And actually, I don't know what I was trying to say. It doesn't mean anything. It doesn't reference anything. It's not coherent or consistent, and those parts needed to go. And so working back and forth with Jenna, she was not only right, she underestimated. We did 6 rounds over 3.5 years.
So she learned your language.
She learned the language of the book to the extent that she had some of the inventions in the book. There were some where she had said, does that sound exactly right? That sounds a little too grammatical in English. Might you do something else there? And she learned the language, and she had this brilliant sense of where to push and where to tap and what should be expanded and what should be cut. And so this book owes an immense amount to her.
Whose idea was that there's no which or who? The what?
That was me.
That was you.
So there are 2 ways of saying, thank you for noticing that. There are 2 ways of saying what in Yiddish. There's the word az, which would be this is what you like, and that can stay what in this book. But there's which or who, and that would all in Yiddish, that would all be vos or vos, and that then had to be translated to what. So in the very first pages,
what was born.
Exactly, and so the first sort of little story is called a Before Maise. Once there was a Jew, what was called Gittel, and Gittel sat once amidst a pile of her siblings, what were called Anshel and Hendel and Zimmel and Reza. When the clan of death came, they took everyone to the forest except for Gittel and one other Jew. The other Jew was called Leib.
I'm sure people have questions now. Yeah? Sally.
I do. I have a few, I'll try to make this one question. Oh, thank you. Is this helping? Okay. My question, we were having a conversation earlier today, I'll just preface, about the politics of language. And I think in our history, and by our, I just mean global history, we understand that Yiddish is an underprivileged language. It's not, and Arabic is too, and a lot of these languages that we consider to be from developing nations or whatever you want to say, these don't give you the cultural capital that languages like English and French give you. And it sucks to compare languages, but I just wonder then, with your choice of language here, and generally with the topics that you cover in these books, both of them, how were they received by the audiences that they're about, sort of? So in this new book, how was it received by Yiddish-speaking Jewish populations, if you know? And the previous book, how was it received by Israelis? How was it received by Palestinians? Just my curiosity there.
Thank you for both of those questions. So first, to talk about Yiddish for a moment and where it falls in the kind of hierarchy of language. It has a very strange place in our contemporary discourse where it's almost doesn't fall into a category, right? It's not taught in third world language contexts because, it's a language that was mostly based in Europe. But I can promise you, if you take a survey course of European poetry from the 19th and 20th century, you are not going to be assigned Yankif Gladstein and Rochel Korn and Anna Margolin. So I think in that way, actually, it's analogous perhaps to indigenous languages in America, where they're housed within a global superpower, but not welcomed within the discourse of the superpower, not seen as part of the language of the superpower. And actually in that way, and I don't know if this is just my own experience, but I actually do find whether it's syntactical or cultural, or I'm just making up something that isn't really there, I do find a lot of conversation between Arabic and Yiddish. The languages feel like they operate in similar parts of my mouth, in similar parts of my being. There's even a way that a final A sound often slopes down in both languages, right? So America becomes Amerike, right? Mushkila becomes mushkile. And and maybe I'm making up this parallel. I don't have an excellent point to make, except for that the two languages feel like they are in conversation with each other. At least in my consciousness. And in terms of the reception of these books, I don't know. I don't know with the new one. It's only 20 days old, and I haven't really heard from Yiddish-speaking folks. And one of the paradoxes is that most folks who speak Yiddish as a mother tongue now live in ultra-Orthodox communities and probably won't come across this book in any way. Maybe if they're folks who grew up in this community and then left the community and then are interested in how folks from without the community are writing about the language. But I haven't yet heard any responses from this one. And in terms of the first book, the responses have been wonderful, and they're also selective. Right? It's also Palestinians or Israelis who read primarily English language novels. Right? So that already is a group that is different from folks who only read in Arabic or folks who only read in Hebrew. It hasn't been translated to either language. The politics of translation are different in each case, but there are all sorts of reasons why it hasn't yet. I hope that it will someday. But the reception has been really interesting. It's been exhilarating to be in conversation with Palestinian American novelists and authors, with Israeli folks who are interested in reading narratives that come from a left perspective without being a sort of simplistic polemic. But thank you for those questions.
Thank you for the reading. I so enjoyed that, and I will be reading the book. When you were reading, it was interesting because you mentioned James Joyce, and I really did feel his spirit being channeled. But what was fascinating to me is that it's a novel, but of course there's so much. You pay so much attention to sound and rhythm, and so I was just wondering, when you were writing, what was the process like? Did you read it out yourself to make that, to feel that? What was happening? Because it did. It was exhilarating to listen to. And just the sound was kind of just took me, and it was amazing. So thank you.
Thank you. So I'll start by saying that if anyone hasn't read Ulysses, James Joyce's novel, I'll tell you how I read it. And it was specifically using that practice, which was the practice of being a poetry reader, which is the practice of not having to understand most or half or even the vast majority of what I'm reading, but rather to allow myself to be washed over by sound. And so with James Joyce, I set a schedule for myself. I said, 20 pages a day for whatever that is, 20 times 800. Is that right? I don't know. So a few months, I said I would read 20 pages a day and read them all out loud to myself, but not exactly to myself, to something. A poetry teacher of mine once said that when you're reading out loud, read to something. Read to a cat. Read to a cactus. It's different. If you read to yourself, you can kind of go, Labe, Charles, lion, main lion, yes. But if you're reading to the cup, you say, Labe, Charles said, lion, yes. It's meaning lion, yes, Labe said, drinking more and wiping his wrist on his mouth's edges, etc. So that was my practice of reading James Joyce, and it's an exquisite practice. Much of the novel is utterly incomprehensible to me, and I know some people read it with a guide, and there are whole books written about how to read it, and I missed most of the references, and that's fine, because I danced with the sounds, and I danced with the wordplay, and I laughed out loud at points, and I was emotionally overcome at points, and then there would be some of the days were miserable. Some of the days would be 20 full pages where I connected to nothing. I understood nothing. And the cup didn't and the cup didn't respond. Exactly. But so in terms of the process of drafting this book, everything was read out loud again and again and again. And I privileged in both books, actually, in this one certainly, but in the first one too, I privileged in a lot of moments sound over sense. I privileged the way something sounds over what it means. And so I'll read a quick section from the first page of my first book, where the narrator, Jonathan, is talking about looking at himself in the mirror of his base's bathroom. But he goes, "You might not have recognized me. My scalp was a hedgehog. My eyes glinted strangely in the glass of the base's bathroom, yellow-green and nearly fearless." And I wrote that, and then I said, wait a second, the glass of the base's bathroom? glass? And I Googled glass, and it says, like, yes, like, archaic British way of saying mirror, used mostly in the early 19th century. And I said, well, that's clearly not how Jonathan would speak, right? Not how a 19-year-old American-Israeli soldier would talk to his friend. But still, my eyes glinted strangely in the mirror of the base's bathroom, yellow, green, and nearly fearless. That sort of triple R bogged down the whole sentence. And so in that moment, I discarded verisimilitude. I've discarded trying to echo the voice for the sake of how those two S's sounded in that particular sentence. And that was certainly all the more so a guide for this book. I read it out loud again and again and again. And a little plug here. With my first one, I was not even invited to audition for the audiobook, but with the second one, I did audition and I read it. So if folks want to hear the audiobook, you get to hear me reading for a few more hours. Back there.
So quite often authors are terrible readers. But you are really, really good.
Thank you.
Where'd you get that pizzazz from?
Thank you. That's a really nice thing to say. And I will say that I think part of so at the same time as I was taking poetry classes with Huda, that I was also discovering sort of the world of spoken word poetry. When I was at Middlebury College, we had a workshop by a poet, Aja Monet, that really, really moved me. And I think what I was moved so much in the world of spoken word poetry was that it felt like it drew from theater. Theater was one of my great loves as a child. I loved being on stage. I think if you'd asked me when I was 14 what I hoped to be doing a few decades later, I think novelist would have been my second choice, and stage actor would have been my first. And so the world of spoken word poetry, that again, as with reading James Joyce out loud, as with reading these kind of Yiddish poems out loud, as with reading these Arabic poems out loud, it is a world of sound. It's where sound is not subordinate to meaning. It's where the way that two words bounce off of each other perhaps is more important than with, what the literal interpretation might be if you study the grammar of the sentence. And I fell in love with that form of poetry then. And since, I think there is an adherence, a loyalty to rhythm, to music, to not putting this kind of hard distinction between sung music and spoken music that I really cherish in the spoken word world of poetry. And so yes, I think it's some combination of theater, spoken word poetry, and just my desire from the time I was a small child to get attention.
Hello.
Whoa, Jesus Christ. Hello.
I'm
You're doing great.
Quieter now. Nope. Louder. Yep. I'm the woman filming you.
Hello.
Hello. So there's three people that came in the other day, and two of them, one was Herman Beaver and one was Chris Mustaza. I don't know if you know them, but they're Penn professors, and they brought in these like old archival sounds, and they were just like so fascinating to me because I'm in creative writing and film. So those are my two main loves. But then aside from that, I don't know where it comes from, but I just like adore sound. And if like I was reincarnated, I'd want to be like an ethnomusicologist or something.
There's still time.
Yeah, maybe. Anyways, that is to say, they brought in these early recordings of a bunch of like modernist poets that were like recorded in these phonetician labs, like in Harvard and Columbia, in Paris and stuff. And they had this early T.S. Eliot one. And it reminded me a lot of your reading, actually, because you have two different characters, and he's reading The Wasteland, and The Wasteland has all these different characters. And, there's not many recordings of him reading it, and to get into different voices, he tries to do like a London working class voice, and he's really bad because he's T.S. Eliot. And I thought that was really funny, and that was just kind of an anecdote, a comment, but it leads to something, which is that I started out in poetry, and you also started out in poetry, or
That's
maybe?
where you're heading.
That's where I'm heading.
That's where you're heading. Okay.
I think the next book hopefully is a collection of poems.
Okay, cool. Yeah, so I started out in poetry and then sort of pivoted to fiction, but I keep them like very distinct in my mind. Well, like my poetry is kind of like prosy, but my like fiction is like sort of poetic. And I'm wondering just like how those two sort of like interface like within like your writing, and how like what sort of tone you're going for and things like that.
Yeah, thank you. For me, poetry is the pinnacle of written art. I think poetry is the top of the mountain. I did an MFA in poetry, and one of the discoveries I'd made in the process of this MFA was that I'm a better novelist than poet, which is a little heartbreaking, but it's okay. And,
There's time.
There's time. But I think that my novels, both of them, owe everything to poetry. As I mentioned, sort of there are specific poets who I see as not only their work as the sort of sparking genesis for the book, but actually the books being a kind of conversation with the poets or with their poems. And I read this passage recently. I'm forgetting the author. Well, I should write that down. But how one of the things that poetry reminds us is to look at linear time with much more skepticism. And this idea, so people talk about, in the Yiddish context, people talk about Yiddish as a dead language, right? So first off, it's not factually true. As I mentioned, there are hundreds of thousands of Orthodox Jews who speak Yiddish as a first language. But also, it's not true because when you're reading a poem, when you're reading in the world of a poem, when I'm reading Jacob Glatstein's poem and then writing a conversation with him, time isn't that relevant. It's not that significant that I live in 2022 and he lived and he was writing a poem in 1922. It doesn't feel that important to me. In the process of reading, in the process of writing, time kind of bends on itself. It becomes less a line that we chug onwards, toward progress or toward catastrophe, whatever the case may be. And it becomes much more circular. And so for me, I think reading poetry, regardless of what I'm writing, reading poetry is always going to be the spark that will sort of set me off on the next writing project. And in both books, there are poems that are referenced, there are poems that are translated, poems that are transliterated, poets who feature. So the epigraph to this new book is from Jacob Glatstein. The poetry of Langston Hughes features prominently, as do his letters from the Soviet Union, where he went to make a film in the early 1930s. And in both of the books, poetry plays a role in influencing the characters and impacting the characters and changing the characters. And I'll say that this is not a book-length poem. It is a novel, and it owes, even as it sort of tries to break and push at and chip away at the form of the novel, it still follows some of the structures and some of the ideas of novels. And I'm curious and excited to see what will happen when I try to finally put together a book that is actually a book of poems.
Thank you.
I think we've run out of time, right? The books are out there, and there are also there's a reception. So hang out with us, and if you have more questions, you can ask them, one-on-one. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Huda. Thank you, everyone.